Now we're going to take a look at Mars through the lens of traditional astrology, as well as through the larger lens of the Western mystery tradition. As we've said previously in our video on Saturn, the ancients decided to create a distinction between the planets as being either benefic planets or supporters of life, or malefic planets or destroyers of life. And for the ancients, two planets, because of their intemperance, were thought of as destroyers of life. Saturn, who is intemperately cold and dry, and Mars, who is intemperately hot and dry. And as a result of that, Mars has the distinction of being a malefic planet within traditional astrology. Claudius Ptolemy tells us that Mars is intemperately hot and dry because he is already exercising heat as a result of the redness of his nature. So the ancients observed that Mars was red, the color of bloodshed, war, anger, and the heart of a furnace, and therefore the heart of fire. So simply based on the color of Mars, the ancients derived this designation of Mars as being a hot and fiery planet. We know from the works of medieval astrologer Abraham ibn Ezra, the ancients also derived these ideas through testing these ideas over the course of hundreds of thousands of years within the charts of people. Therefore, we both have this understanding as Mars as a natural phenomenon, but we also have this understanding of Mars based on what Mars signifies within our own lives when Mars is active within our own charts in a very pronounced way. Now, that's only one part of the designation of the nature of Mars. The other part of why the ancients thought that Mars was a hot and fiery planet is because within the Chaldean order of Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon, the sphere of Mars is coming directly above the sphere of the Sun. And therefore, Mars is appropriating unto himself a great deal of the heat that he derives simply based on his proximity to the Sun within the Chaldean order. And for this reason, Mars was thought of as the god of war. The planet Mars is thought of as one of the authors of color, or red bile within us. Now, we know that from a physiological perspective, bile is a substance that is produced by the liver. Excess bile is stored in the gallbladder and slowly released into the small intestines along with pancreatic juice to facilitate the emulsification of fats, or the breakdown of fats within our foods. And as a result of that, we think of bile as having this hot and dry corrosive nature. Even though bile is actually a liquid substance, we think of bile as being this corrosive substance that has the ability to essentially burn through and break down fats. Therefore, Mars is associated with yellow bile, which is also known as red bile within traditional astrology. And people who have an excess amount of bile within their system, or people who are constitutionally bilious, are people who are that much more prone to anger, to passion, to excitement, to leadership, and to all of these qualities that we associate with the planet Mars. Now, if we take a look at the glyph of the planet Mars, we see that Mars is a planet that has two potential glyphs. On the one hand, we have the glyph that many of us are more accustomed to seeing, which is the glyph of Mars with a circle on the bottom and an arrow pointing towards the right. But there's also a glyph of Mars which has a circle on the bottom and a cross surmounting that circle. Let's go into breaking down what both of these glyphs mean. As we know, from a metaphysical perspective, the circle is representing the unity that exists within the human soul. And this is and isn't true, because we tend to think of the circle in two ways in traditional Western metaphysics. We think about the circle associated with the individuality of the human soul, in other words, our microcosm, And we also think about another type of circle, a larger circle which is associated with the morphic field out of which we all derive our being. In other words, the macrocosm. But for all intents and purposes, when we're speaking about the circle within the context of the planetary glyphs, we're always speaking about the circle as designating the specific soul of the human individual. And by extension of that, we're also thinking about the circle in its designation as representing the sun within traditional astrology. Therefore, we can pretty much also draw the glyph of Mars as having the sun on the bottom with the arrow pointing towards the right side. So if we think about this Mars glyph as having the sun at the bottom, we see that there is the individuality of the human soul in radiant expression. The arrow portion of this glyph is meant to symbolize our directedness, or a part within all of us that has this desire to be and become more than that which we already are. And so when we see this sun and arrow glyph within the context of the Mars glyph, we get this idea of the individual soul of the person strives to become that which is greater than the seminal substance of that individual soul, which is represented by the sun, and it strives to become something else. When we think about Mars, we think about us having a fire within ourselves that desires to know more of who it is by spreading that fire into the world around it, and by broadening the parameters that define what our individual landscape of life is. Now, this is wonderful, and all of us have this Martian principle within us, this Martian principle of wanting to go out into the world as a voyager, a conqueror, taking in more of the world around us and reconstituting that world into ourselves. The problem with that becomes when we don't know how to control that desire within ourselves and how to prevent that desire within ourselves from encroaching upon somebody else's desire to do the same. And so within life, we find us all essentially having this battle of this Martian principle within ourselves, where, as a means of expressing our desire to live and as a means of expressing our desire to become something at all, we oftentimes find ourselves rubbing harshly against the parameters that other people have within their lives to do the same. And when we allow other people's Martian power to encroach upon our own sphere of Mars, it can feel as if we're living a smaller life, and it can also feel as if we are allowing other people to have power over us. So, the Martian principle is foundational to how we all grow and expand and become everything that we're meant to be in this lifetime. But as we all navigate these terrains of Mars within our material experience, we should also be mindful about how we not only allow ourselves to be encroached upon by other people's Mars principle, but also how we allow our Mars principle to encroach upon others. So on one level, that is what this Mars glyph is representing. It's representing our desire to go beyond the seminal substance, the seed substance, which is represented by the sun glyph, and expand ourselves into another field of creative existence, which is why the arrow of Mars is never pointing towards the left. When we see the arrow of Mars within the Kabbalistic tarot and within astrology in general, the arrow of Mars never points towards the left, because the left is referring to the feminine part of the cosmos, and it's also referring to the part of the cosmos that is still existing in a state of primordial chaos and that hasn't become anything as yet. The left side is corresponding with the morphic field out of which we all arise, and is not corresponding with substance that has already been beaten into the shape of anything specific. Whereas when we point this arrow towards the right side, the right is essentially pointing towards the masculine principle, which has already taken into itself this desire and this definite decision to grow in one specific way. Therefore, when we see the arrow of Mars pointing towards the right side, it's pointing towards the side of definite determination to become one specific thing. And the specificity of Mars and this desire of Mars to move in that specific direction is very largely what is existing as the motive force that causes all of us to move towards any specific direction or path within our lifetime. Now, that is one way of talking about this glyph of Mars. Another way that we can describe the glyph of Mars, which is probably a less esoteric way, is to speak about the very real fact that the glyph of Mars is also meant to represent a testicle and a penis. And the reason for this is because Mars is representing this phallic principle in nature. Mars is representing this fiery principle of generation in nature. And Mars is representing the mobilization of the seed element, which in all cases is always going to be held within the circle portion of the Mars glyph, and the movement of that seed element out of the body of the man to move out into the world to inseminate the world so that the world can take on new life. This reminds me of the story of the birth of Venus, in which her father, Uranus, was essentially castrated by his son Saturn, and Saturn threw the phallus of his father down into the ocean, and the seed, or the sperm from Uranus's phallus, is what bubbled up to the surface and gave rise to the goddess of love and sensuality and pleasure, which is Venus, who we're going to be speaking about in the next video. But in a very real way, we see how Mars is very much central to this idea of the creation of love. Because from the phallus, which is represented by Mars, we find the goddess of love arising within the context of traditional Western mysticism. Now, let's talk a little bit more about some of the metaphysical ideas that have arisen within the context of Western mysticism as it relates to the glyph of Mars. John Dee, who is both an astrologer as well as an esotericist in the 16th century, is the author of the book The Hieroglyphic Monad. And in Theorem 13 of the Hieroglyphic Monad, John Dee writes, "Now regarding the mystical character of Mars, is it not formed from the hieroglyphs of the Sun and Aries, the magistry of the elements partly intervening?" This idea that Mars is formed from the Sun and Aries once again comes from this notion that the Sun will always represent the circular portion of any of our planetary glyphs. Aries is thought of in this context as representing the head of the arrow, and the elements intervening, as far as John Dee is concerned, is the fact that between that Sun glyph and that Mars glyph, we can essentially project the cross of matter. And sometimes when we see Mars being drawn within traditional Western astrology, we do see Mars being drawn as having the Sun as the basis, the Aries glyph as the apex, and the cross of matter between the two of them. What this glyph says is that the seminal power of the Sun finds the fulfillment of its operations through the material elements of this earth, and those material elements of this earth are fueled towards their highest manifestation as a result of the fire element, represented by the glyph of Aries. And so what this means is that the soul within all of us, which is what the Sun glyph represents, because remember, the soul, the S-O-U-L, sounds pretty much the same as the Latin word for sun, which is soul, S-O-L. And so the Sun glyph is representing the soul within all of us. The cross, as we know from our previous video on the derivation of the glyphs of the planets, is representing the human body, and the glyph of Aries is representing the root of the power of fire within our cosmos. Therefore, in the Glyph of Mars, we're seeing a very real directive for what all of us are meant to be doing within this lifetime. All of us are meant to take the seed stuck within ourselves, which is represented by the sun glyph, and we're meant to mobilize those spiritual seeds that are planted deeply within our nature through the use of our physical body within this world. And so here within the Mars glyph, we're seeing that our physical body isn't meant to be the conquering force over the soul within us, but our soul is meant to be the fuel that drives our physical body with all of its elemental parts towards the fulfillment of that which is higher than anything that we can attain purely through our flesh. Our soul, represented by the sun, is meant to fuel our physical body, represented by the cross glyph, towards the fulfillment of our destiny, which is essentially represented by the Aries glyph within this glyph of Mars. And the reason why we consider the Aries glyph to represent our destiny is because within the Corpus Hermeticum, we're told that the human being is made up of two bodies. We have our spiritual body, and we also have our physical body made out of flesh. But we also find this being said to us by Heraclitus, one of the fathers of Western philosophy, who said to us that the world is an everlasting fire. But he also says to us that man, or that the human being, is made up of two bodies, a body of flesh, but also a body of fire. And it is the job of the body of flesh within this lifetime, represented by the cross glyph, to fulfill the purposes of the body of fire and to move in the direction of the fire element, which is represented by the Aries glyph at the apex of our symbol for Mars. Now, let's talk about the second glyph of Mars that exists within traditional astrology. Within this glyph, we find the sun at the bottom, and we find the cross surmounting this sun. And so, in a very real way, this is a reverse image of the glyph of Venus, where we have the sun surmounting the cross of matter. What this glyph of Mars represents, this notion that everything that we consider to be of an earthly nature is fueled purely by solar power. And on a macrocosmic level, that solar power is SOLAR, but on our microcosmic level, that solar power is SOULAR, saying that all of the operations of our physical body within this lifetime are fueled by the power of the soul within us. And since we know that it is the soul within us that is fueling our desire to be and become within this world, it is our job to not only allow the soul to fuel the body, and also carry out activities within our physical body to refeed the soul and to pour power and life back into the soul. And to this end, I prefer the glyph of Mars with the sun at the bottom, the cross in the middle, and the Aries glyph on the apex a little bit more than this glyph of the sun at the bottom and the cross above it, because I believe that this first glyph of Mars with Aries on the apex, it speaks more fully to this desire within all of us to reach outward and grasp the everlasting fire, which is essentially what we're meant to be doing within this lifetime in any event. Now, as we all know, the ancients thought that the 7 classical planets all had dominion over the 9 months of pregnancy. And the ancients tell us that Mars's dominion over the 3rd month of pregnancy has to do with him giving blood to the fetus, has to do with him bringing about this reddening principle within the fetus, and it has to do with Mars implanting within the fetus this desire to charge forward down the path of evolution. This desire to charge forward down the path of evolution within Western mysticism is represented by the principle of sulfur. We see the glyph of sulfur, which has the triangle of fire surmounting the cross of matter. this glyph of sulfur is kind of synonymous with the glyph of Mars, insofar as the glyph of sulfur is once again saying to us that the earth element is meant to feed our desire to find the everlasting flame. Because imagine if there were no fire triangle surmounting that earth of matter, then we would all just be stuck within this damp darkness of the earth element, and none of us would have the urge or the impetus within ourselves to go down a path of evolution, because we would all be content within our mud-like earth existence. However, these glyphs, the glyph of both sulfur as well as the glyph of Mars, is meant to tell us and instruct us essentially into what the purpose of our earth existence actually is. The purpose of this physical body is to be a vehicle so that we can reach outward towards that which is not physical. Because in the process of grasping that which is eternal while we're still in this physical body, that process is essentially the process of enlightenment. And this is something that we all have within our grasp to do. We all have the ability to break the illusion that we only exist in this physical body to pursue the paths and the courses set forward for us by our physical body. And the glyphs of both Mars and sulfur lets us know that it is within all of our power to reach upward towards heaven and grasp the eternal fire.